Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus doing a breakdown on the Modern Prelim, or the Pioneer Prelims actually, for December 30th through January 2nd. As a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing as we aim to be the most informative Modern and Pioneer YouTube channel for Magic. Very similar to the breakdown we did with the Modern Prelims. I'll have a link to the card above. Written down the prelims, which decks did the best, kind of trends, decks that are kind of performing in these events. The prelims are kind of your pre-PTQs of the sort on Magic Online now. Generally they fire with the Pioneer and the Modern events. Some of the other formats, not so much. Standard, Legacy, kind of hard to track this kind of data, but it is kind of useful for seeing kind of the two most played formats on Magic Online. In Pioneer, the decks that did the best performing were Mono Red Aggro, Mono Black Aggro, Mono Green Ramp, Lotus Field decks, Is It Phoenix, Green Aggro, and other. Mono Green Ramp Aggro, or Mono Red Aggro, is a bit of a misnomer because there are basically two different style of decks I've included in this. It's kind of the lower to the ground Red Aggro deck that you'd expect to be like a burn deck or prowess deck, and then there's also the Mono Red mid-range decks I'll be covering a little bit later in the video, describing kind of the differences in the two decks. Mono and Green Ramp are kind of the spiritual successors to the Bant Field decks. They kind of ramp into a large Eldrazi and kind of win the game arbitrarily with those kind of threats, things like Ulamog, things like Ugin, etc. Is It Phoenix kind of needs no introduction. The one big change from a lot of the modern decks and a lot of the early iterations in Pioneer is a lot of these decks have flipped over to Young Pyromancer as their main threat. Green Aggro, kind of the successors to the Simic Stompy and Gruul decks that kind of populated things when the various Oko decks were running around. These decks are kind of going over the top now with things like Ghalta and such, aspect of Hydra. So they're going a little bit bigger to kind of overpower some of these other aggro decks. And one notable thing in these events was the not great performance of control decks. One of the decks people were highlighting, especially the Pioneer deck podcast and stuff, a deck that was kind of poised to take off was the blue-white control decks. And while the overall data on MTG Goldfish does support the fact that blue-white control is one of the best decks in the format, in these kind of high-stakes events, it looks like a lot of people were shying away from playing the basically heavy Planeswalker, no-win con blue-white control decks, or they're just not doing well. That said, let's get into breakdowns of some of the archetypes that did well, and people might be interested in knowing what they're doing. So the first deck up is Mono Red Aggro, Mono Red Prowess, Mono Red Burn, however you want to call it. This one is particular by Canister. Once again, he needs no introduction. This deck is a little bit lower to the ground and running a small wizard package in the form of Lava Mancer or Lava Runner and Soulscar Mage. This allows Wizard's Lightning to be played as a supplemental burn spell in addition to Wild Slash and Lightning Strike. Stirring Blood here to help deal with other small creature decks, and then kind of the top end with Bone Crusher Giant. It's kind of a 2-of. Sideboard does have the ability to potentially go bigger with 4 copies of Munivault, Chandra Accolade of Flame, Goblin Chain Whirler, and Chandra Torch of Defiance and Glorybringer. So this deck is very much a kind of transitional low to the ground mono red aggro deck, and then can go kind of bigger in some of the grindier mid-range matchups. Reason we kind of broke this down is just showing that the take a look at this list. This list is doing much the same thing. So this is kind of like the red-black aggro decks from a couple of standard seasons ago. Some versions would start out with things like Bomat Courier and stuff in the main deck, and then they'd kind of sideboard into a bigger kind of mid-range and control deck. I'm just kind of showing this why I grouped all of the mono-red aggro decks into one grouping, because basically it's just a matter of, do you want to start small and potentially go big post-board, or do you just want to start big like the next deck that we are going to cover. Next deck we're going to cover is kind of the other side of the mono-red aggro deck. You have some early pressure here, things like Soulscar Mage and Kari Zev and such, but you're definitely a go bigger deck in the main deck, using things like Rekindling Phoenix, Glorybringer, Goblin Chain Whirler, and this deck is a little bit lighter on removal comparatively with things like Lightning Strike and Wild Slash not having additional things like Wizard's Lightning and such. But the one thing about this is you have much higher individual threats. Obviously, Chain Ruler can clear out a bunch of X1s. Kindling Phoenix can be hard to deal with. Glorybringer, probably the most powerful 5-drop in the format as far as creatures. Chandra Torch of Defiance might be the default best Planeswalker left in the format. And then obviously you're playing all your lands in the main deck. The downside is you're a little bit more vulnerable to the next deck that we're going to be talking about, decks like Mono Green Ramp. And you tend to struggle with being fast enough to close out that matchup before they can kill you. I'm sure it's still an overall positive matchup, but they are bringing in things like Goblin Rabble Master, Chandra's Defeat for the Mono Red Mirror, and such. This deck is already in the big form, so it uses things like Rabble Master and Scrap Claim Berserker to kind of go a little bit faster in certain matchups, like in Control and such, where you need a few more threats where like your Wild Slashes aren't particularly effective. And then, beyond that, Tormod's Crypt kind of for the Dredgeless Dredge decks and the zombie Rally the Ancestors decks that have been popping up that can be quite effective in certain spots. And let's talk about probably the two biggest go big strategies in the format next. So the first go big strategy that's kind of popped up in the place of the banned Field of the Dead decks is these kind of Eldrazi based ramp decks. Basically they're trying to use things like Arboreal Grazer, Elvish Mystic, Elvish Rejuvenator to get various lands into play, using things like Castle Garenbrig and Shrine of the Forsaken Gods to help pump out your powerful spells of Ugin the Spirit Dragon, Ulamog, World Breaker. These are kind of your mid-range Bridge the Gap threats. Cavalier Thorns allows you to find a land. Oblivion Sower allows you to find land off the top of your opponent's decks. Uinwoln Hydra allows you to hit your various 1-0s like Arch of Araska, Blast Zone, Radiant Fountain against the aggro decks, Sanctum of Ugin. So a lot of very powerful things crammed into a mono green shell. Sideboard cards, obviously mono greens have access to a ton of removal, but they do a Spatial Contortion, and obviously have access to Perilous Vault, which is an interesting sweeper. This is a card that I played some time in Standard, and then Thought Not Seer can come in against kind of the aggressive decks, or not against. I guess it can come in against the aggressive decks to help slow them down. Can come in against the control decks to kind of take away a key card and to be an additional early threat, and can kind of disrupt the next deck we'll be talking about, which is the Lotus Storm combo decks. So this is a deck that has had many different iterations and such. As far as how it wins, it changes from build to build. There's a lot of different things on the sideboard which people get access to with Fae of Wishes, but basically the deck is trying to set up copies of Lotus Field backed up by Thespian Stage to get multiple copies into play, and then using things like Hidden Strings and those kind of cards, Pour Over the Pages to untap lands, basically generating a huge amount of mana, using things like Vizier of Tumbling Sands to untap them, and then using things like Fae of Wishes to go get whatever you happen to need out of the sideboard. There's some combination of wins with double cast. I forget what exactly the win combination is, but basically the deck tries to go and grab one of these big bombs out of the sideboard and kind of close out the game that way. Omniscience and Enter the Infinite allows you to basically draw your entire deck, win that way, and allows you to cast Jace World or Mysteries and then win the game that way. You can also win the game on the back of Chandra Awaker and Inferno and Ugin the Spirit Dragon. Thought Distortion's an interesting one. Kind of disrupts a lot of what your opponent's doing. And then, there's just kind of a bunch of bullets that you need for different situations. Anger of the Gods to kind of buy you some time against the aggro decks. Lost Legacy to stop other combo decks or cards that rely on one key thing. Supreme Verdict is another sweeper. So this deck has a lot of different play lines and such. I have not actually picked up or played much against it, so I'm not entirely sure what the deck's doing beyond getting these Lotus Fields into play, generating a bunch of mana, and then kind of winning arbitrarily from there with whatever they happen to come across from their Fae of Wishes, or there's some type of combo with double cast and Ral. Is it the 4-mana Ral that's in Standard right now? It's very similar to the Expansion Explosion combo. I'm not exactly sure how it works on a strategic level, but I think there's some combination with double cast where you can chain them, with a RAL in play, and that's one way to win the game. This person's kind of chosen to forego that and just winning with, either Jace Wilder of Mysteries or some other, just being overpowering them with things like Chandra Awakened Inferno and Ugin the Spirit Dragon. And finally, on to the go bigger green aggro decks that have begun to pop up on some of these events. Final version of the deck that we're going to talk about is kind of a hybrid between the Nykthos decks that were using things like Inland Whirls, Gnomish Mystic, and Burning Tree Emissary to pump out huge amounts of creatures. This is also a mono green aggro deck, trying to ramp with these guys into things like Lovestruck Beast, Ronus, Steely Champion, and Yarvo. Obviously, this is a lot of power for what the 3-mana they bring to the table. You're trying to use this and then top end with Surrak Hunt Color, giving things haste, and then Ghalta is just kind of the ultimate go over the top for some of these aggro matchups, like mono black aggro, mono red aggro, etc. that have popped up. Aspect of Hydra gives you a very phenomenal pump spell to end the game very quickly, especially if you either have a creature with trample because of Ronus, or if you happen to have a Ghalta in play. This just kind of ends the game on the spot. Beyond that, got a little bit of utility in your land base here with the Hashap Oasis and the Nykthoses. Nykthos is obviously allowing you to pump out a bunch of mana with all your 2 and 3 mana, or 2 and 3 green creatures, and then Hashap Oasis, another pump spell to allow you to pump through a bunch of damage very quickly. Sideboard, obviously, Heroic Intervention, kind of your catch-all against Supreme Verdict decks. Cure gives you a little bit of grind, as well as Shaper Sanctuary against a deck with a bunch of spot removal. Hunt the Hunter, good for the green mirror basically. Then Feed the Clans, pretty good against the other aggro decks in the format, especially mono red, giving you that little bit extra time for your bigger, beefier creatures to kind of end the game. Overall, I think the format is in a very interesting place. The fact that the green aggro decks, the green ramp decks, and mono black aggro decks have all taken a hit, and that there's still a very large portion, at least, of the PPTQ scene, well, basically PPTQ scene, I think is an interesting sign, and the fact that there's still a combo deck even after the Simic Nexus decks have been banned, that Lotus Field obviously gives rise to that there's at least one pretty solid combo deck in the format, and then obviously Blue-White Control and some of the mid-range decks are starting to pop up. So seems like the format's starting to approach a pretty good balance point where creatures are relevant, combo can be a little bit relevant, control can be relevant, so basically you can play almost any much cup of tea that you want to play and still have a pretty functional deck in the format. So let me know what you think of these breakdowns, if this is something you guys are interested in seeing more of in the future. As I've done with the modern things, I'm going to be playing a couple short deck, like maybe hour-long decks that I enjoy or trying to learn. Like I might try to play the Lotus Field deck, understanding that I'm not going to be an expert with the deck. I'm going to learn as I play, but I will show you guys some of the mechanics of the deck and learning how to play those decks. So hopefully that knowledge will be useful to you guys as you make your decisions for decks in those particular formats, or understanding maybe how to combat those decks from another deck's perspective. So anyways, this has been John from MTG Nexus. Hope you guys are having a great day.